Hi, I'm Lois Kelly, and welcome to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm the one kicking it off this time. My name is Chris Murman. I'm joined by my fellow AU board member, Colleen Johnson. Hi, Colleen.
Hey, Chris.
What up? You got snow on the ground?
We've got a lot of snow on the ground, 12 inches here in Denver to kick off our Thanksgiving week.
You can have it. I don't know what that's like. And we're joined by your friend Esther Derby. Hi, Esther. How are you?
Hi, Chris. Hi, Colleen. Hey, your snow's headed my way, so
we're sharing.
We're expecting 12 inches here tomorrow.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Esther. We're super happy to have you on the show and really excited to chat with you about your new book.
My pleasure, and I'm hoping my dog will be quiet.
What is your dog's name? I don't think we asked that when we were chatting before.
My dog's name is Izzy, and she is a French bulldog.
Oh, Izzy?
Yeah, she is the best dog trainer I know, in that she has been very effective in training me.
We might need some pictures of Izzy for the show notes.
Yeah. And we're talking about, as Colleen just mentioned, we're talking about Esther's new book, 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. I'm not going to waste the time going through Esther's bio because we know Esther and we love her. And this is a topic that we've actually been hearing you talk about over the last several years. So when did the idea of 7 rules first enter your brain space?
Well, at first it was 6 rules.
Oh.
And yes, and I would not be a good role model if I, refused to add another rule. So it started as 6 rules, and I gave a talk at a conference in fall of 2015. And I got a really great response, and it caused me to think about things more. And so I did another talk, and I got another round of input from people and how the questions they were asking. And that process kept going for a few years, where I'd talk about it. The questions people would ask me would make me think about it more, and I'd incorporate new stuff into the talk, into the rules, and it ended up as 7.
Well, 7 is a perfect number in some cultures, right?
Yeah, it is.
I remember when I first started writing blog posts, I read a tip that says if you're going to add a number of things, always have it be an odd number, whether like 3, 5, 7, whatnot. I don't know why that is. I'm glad you found an extra rule.
Someone has researched it, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
There's a PhD thesis about it somewhere.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So a thesis that I'm sure that will sit on my nightstand for many, many months. So now this is not your first book, Esther, as many listeners know. So what was this process like down the journey of getting the book from idea to out on shelves?
I need to take a time out. The dog is at the back door.
Oh, okay. No worries. Right, we can pause. Yeah, no worries.
Hurry up, guys.
Hurry up, Biz.
Boy, I'm so sorry, but when this dog goes to the back door, she's serious.
Yeah,
so
that's okay. Okay,
I'll have to get up and let her back in.
No worries. Okay, so the question was this is not your first book, as many listeners will know. So what was the process like from, idea to shelf this time? Was it different? What'd you learn about yourself during this writing process?
I learned that it is possible to be stuck And it's
And you've
also
never been
possible to
stuck
get,
before?
oh yeah, I've been stuck. Well, I've been stuck before, but it's an interesting and not particularly pleasant place to be. And what it took for me to get unstuck was having an organizing structure for the chapters. I mean, I had an organizing structure for the whole book, which is, 6 rules. There you have an organizing structure right there. But I needed one for the chapters. And once I had that, I got unstuck. And I did what I lovingly call my vomit draft, which was just get it all out there. And then went through an edit, and then I got with the book contract. And the editors at the publisher said, well, we have some ideas for how you can improve your book. And I said, I think it's fine the way it is. and then they came, they have a process, Barrett Kohler, who I published with, has a process of reader feedback. And the feedback came in like 9 months later. And I looked at it and I said, that's sort of interesting. Perhaps I should look at the manuscript again, which I hadn't looked at for 9 months. And I looked at it and can I swear on this show? I better
Sure,
not
why
swear.
not?
And I said, what the hell were you thinking, Esther? This is a mess. And so I rewrote the whole thing in the space of 3 weeks.
Wow.
And I kept the structure, but I just cleaned it up and I tightened it up. And I mean, there were some stories like, I thought that related to this point, but I'm not seeing the connection anymore. So I think very often it is useful to take some time away, right? Because it's really,
the gap.
Yeah,
The
it's
gap
really
in
easy
time.
to become, kind of in love with what you've written, or to lose perspective on what you've written, and to feel some sense of, I worked so hard on this, it must be really great. And so not looking at the manuscript for 9 months was a really great thing, because I could come back at it with a very fresh perspective. And I recognized that there were a lot of places to improve it. So I'm really glad I did that. I wish I knew the trick of just writing a whole book in 3 weeks, but I don't. So
Well, it sounds like there were some good lessons along the way that you probably were able to from the book, right, around embracing change and how to adapt some of the stuff that you're talking about.
Well, and one of the main things is not being too attached to your your going in idea, and being willing to modify it based on new information, which is essentially what I did with the process of the feedback.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I modified what I was going forward with based on what I was hearing. I'm going to take a little time out and let my dog in, and then I'll be right back.
Chris, I think that's probably a good segue for us too. I know there's a section where she talks about you don't have to have all the right answers. We could use that as a way to kind of bridge back to the change questions.
Yeah. You can, you want to lead us back in with that?
Sure.
You don't have to.
Sorry.
It's okay.
So Esther, I think that's probably a great bridge to talking through some of the topics in your book about change. And, one of the things that really stood out to me as a coach and a consultant is that you say you don't have to have all the right answers, right? And let's dig into that a little. When we think about our roles in an Agile space and in an Agile community, why is change so important for us to understand?
Well, we're trying to help people change the way they do their work. So it's not sufficient to understand Agile methods, Scrum, XP, technical practices. It's not sufficient. It's super useful, but we also have to understand the process by which change happens for individuals and also on an organizational level.
People are always the hard part, right, of change.
Well, and also there's like a preciousness to it, right? That you were talking about your book not being so steadfast with well, this is, it was 6 rules and then it became 7, instead of holding on to being like, no, it's 6 rules. My rules are precious. They will stay precious, right? You were able to step away, right? It's the same thing with change. We see change as either scary, or it's this magical thing, or there's this preciousness to whatever we do. They view it, it's almost like change is held up to this place that it really shouldn't be. It's just kind of a step along the way, right?
Yeah, well, people change all the time.
Yeah.
We all change all the time. I mean, biologically as humans, we're changing every day. So it's a human thing. And people choose change all the time. Each one of us has chosen change in different ways in our personal lives. I mean, I heard you mention your fiance, which means you've chosen to make a big change in your life. Congratulations.
Yes.
Congratulations.
All you have to do is say fiance and Colleen starts getting giddy.
I know, I'm so excited for you.
Yeah. And I chose to move from a large city to a town of 100,000 people. I mean, and Colleen, you have 3 kids, so you've made some choices about what you want your life to be like. So we all do that all the time.
Yeah.
What people in general don't like is being told to change, and to being told how to do things, and to having threats held over them if they don't change, and being asked to do things that they are pretty sure aren't going to work.
Yeah. There's a talk that I do on control that kind of relates to this topic. The reason why celebrity self-help books and celebrity cookbooks are so popular is that we see someone that we want to be like, and they say, well, I did this, right? I want to look like Tom Brady, and he's so I'm going to do his workout method or his diet or something like that. Or, there's a lot of those things that we think, the fact that we're wearing different clothes today than we did yesterday shows that we have the ability to change. We just see that change is a good thing. And we don't always see change in organizations as a good thing.
Well, and I like what you said, Esther. It's often feeling like you're saying, Chris, too, like we don't have control over the change that's being done to us. I think, digging in a little to some of the rules, I think the 3rd rule is honoring the past. And that one stood out. If I could take one piece of this book and have every agile coach on earth read it, it would be that section. Because to me, that stood out as, when there's fear, when we go into an organization to try to help them change the way they're working. I think that fear comes from feeling like change is being done to them, not with them.
Right.
And I loved the parts that you outlined in that section around how to help bring them along and invite them into that process by acknowledging what they've been through before you ever step in the door.
Right. Well, and the other thing is, we're talking about adults who have been doing their jobs for, some number of years, and they are not empty vessels into which we pour the agile, right? I mean, they know stuff about their context, they know stuff about their code base, they know stuff about their organization and their customers and all this other stuff that as someone coming in from the outside, we don't know. We may have a certain perspective and can see things with fresh eyes and have some ideas that could be helpful, but they're not, blank slates that we're writing on, right? And neither is the organization a blank slate. I think this is actually one of the big issues I see in a lot of changes, and I talk about it in one of the other rules, assess what is, which is every organization we go into is experiencing some sort of pattern of results, right? The system is doing what it does. And if we just slap the agile on top of it, the existing pattern is going to reassert itself, right? We have to look at what holds the existing pattern in place and start working with that if we want to create an environment or the possibility for something new to take hold.
Yeah. We come in with tools and ideas and tips or whatever, but we don't have the context, right? So that what is kind of pairing who they are and where they are with these things. And that's where change gets to be so interesting for people like us, is because those little minutia of differences is really what probably makes it fun for us to do, because it's different every time. Even though companies generally have the same problems, it always manifests itself in different ways.
Yeah, and that, because they have different business models and different ways people are rewarded and different things that are prioritized within the company. There's always a different set of things we can look at to adjust to make it more likely that the company will be able to improve its ability to deliver software on a regular cadence.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have to look at what exists that you need to modify or adjust in some way, and what you need to add in terms of learning and capabilities for people to actually work in an agile way.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that stood out to me, as we're thinking about the fear around change, was when you talk about experiments and making those experiments as small as possible, right? And I think one thing that really stood out to me there is I think people get very, they get scared when they feel like a change is permanent, right? You're bringing this new set of practices or this new methodology, and we're locked into it, even if it doesn't work for us.
Sure.
And I loved that thinking of like, how do we make these as small as possible so that and for, position them as experiments. If this doesn't work, let's reevaluate what we're doing. And I think that invites a different perspective on the change that's taking place around people.
Sure. And it's less likely to threaten identity, which I think is one of the big reasons people respond to change and reject, a particular idea, is that it speaks to their core identity. So, for example, I talked to a woman who, she was talking about a very successful change effort in her company, which it was actually a persuasion effort. It wasn't a particular change, but they were trying to get people to get the flu vaccine. And then she described another change that didn't work well. And that change was eliminating a layer of management. And she couldn't understand why people were against it. And she said, this is a huge cost saving. How could anybody be against a huge cost saving? And she hadn't considered the fact that for all the people who would be going back to staff positions, they were losing status, they were losing part of their identity, they had maybe gone graduate programs to get degrees to enable them to be in a management role. And for them, it was a huge loss of identity. And that often plays into change. What is people's identity?
Thaler's book Nudge kind of touches upon that in terms of how we structure the choices. The choice architecture is kind of talked about in that book, like how we present choices. Sometimes it kind of feels underhanded to me to a degree because we're trying to nudge them in a certain way or another, but like defaulting to, yes, of course you want to get the flu shot, or yes, you want to put money into your 401k, like defaulting to the choice that we hope people make, right, makes it seem a little easier, right? And so I always try to keep in mind when I'm presenting choices, I know that I have a bias in it, and even though I try to not have it as much as possible, there's still something I hope they choose to do, right? And how I present them sometimes has an effect, right?
So why not have people involved in thinking about what the choices are?
Yeah.
Right. They know the context. They may have ideas that are, more creative and original than what I could come up with. I'm reminded of a story. I'm not going to be able to remember the citation for this, but it had to do with a company that was experiencing some severe financial challenges, and they were considering, I think, closing plants and laying people off. And instead of doing that in a top-down manner, they involved a wide swath of people from the actual organization in figuring out how can we address these challenges. And the people who were involved came up with choices that involved significant sacrifice on their parts. I mean, many people took pay cuts. Well, they found lots of ways to save money. But the ideas that they came up with were their ideas, obviously. So they had some investment in them, but they were in some ways more, the word that's coming to mind is drastic. I don't know if that's the right word, but the impacts on them were greater than the original plan that management had come up with.
But they owned that plan.
But they owned it.
Yep.
And had that plan come down from the top, it would have been, I don't like the word resistance in general, but people would have fought it. They would have not gone over well, and there would have been a huge effort to persuade or cajole or coerce people into going along with that plan. But when involved and treated like responsible adults, the people in this situation said, "Oh yeah, we see it's really serious, and here's how we can help the situation," and the plan went forward. So I think involving people in the choices is a good idea.
I've read something very similar on a blog about a family that applies a lot of Scrum practices at home, and they do like a retrospective basically around when the kids get in trouble, how are you going to change your behavior? And the dad that was writing this article was saying that his kids were far harder on themselves in terms of punishment for behaviors or for grades or whatever the case may be. He was like, they are far harder on themselves than I ever would be, but it gives them a greater sense of ownership over making that change in their life and changing what they're doing if they have the ability to say, this is what I'm going to do differently going forward. And I think that's back to your sense of control, right? You're invested in that when you have control over that outcome.
And it builds their sense of agency, right? Which is a fancy psychological term for saying, I can be an actor in my own life, right? I'm not just a hapless victim with things happening to me. And that's super important for people's mental health, is to feel that you have some agency, some control in a situation.
So you brought up, so when we were talking about kind of this resistance and when change first occurs in organizations, you talk about this kind of in the intro piece of your book, but I get asked a lot about how do we make this change? Like, okay, you get one team to do something or a program inside an organization to do something. Well, great. Well, how do we standardize it across? Like, how do we make this the standard? We need all people to be doing this all thing because the best way to make change effective is to make it standardized across. I run into that all the time with my work. So when you run into that, like, how do you receive that topic of standardization, and also how do you tackle it?
Well, I think it is the result of a big old hangover of mechanistic thinking. We have spent, most of us, the majority of our working lives, or at least for me, I guess there are people now who have not spent the majority of their working lives in with a mechanistic mindset, but it certainly is part of our history. And in that mindset, designing for operation, efficiency is king. It's how you save money. It's how you be competitive in your market. So I recognize that it is a very, very common way of thinking, and it's not surprising people think that way. So then I start asking questions and saying, well, are all the teams doing the same work? Are they all working on the same sort of thing? Some of these projects are experimental versus some of these projects are, keeping a system creaking along, or, maintaining, operations or something. So let's look at the different kinds of work. Does it still make sense to have a standard? Yeah. Generally, it doesn't, right? And actually standardizing when the work is highly variable causes greater inefficiencies.
Wow. I like those words.
Yeah.
Colleen, how do you usually tackle, like when you get asked the standardization question, like how do you usually receive that?
Going back to what we're talking about with the sense of agency, I tend to give teams a lot of autonomy. I look at everything we do as kind of a recipe, and we're bringing you a recipe based on our experience and what we've seen successful. But I think I tend to let teams take a lot of autonomy in their process once we've got kind of those foundation layers established. And sometimes that means stepping back and letting them make decisions that might feel like bad decisions. And learn from them, right? And I always use the example of that organization I was doing some Kanban coaching with, where it was a IT team that wanted their WIP to be their WIP limits to be 30 per person. It was like, why have them? But I said, okay, let's try it. And to Esther's point, let's do a small experiment here. Let's give it 2 weeks at that. And let's, do you think your cycle time will go up or go down? And let's check back in and see if it's giving you the desired output that you want. And I tried to make it small, so we weren't really having a huge, not introducing a big risk to the business, but I gave them, the autonomy to try it and see what happens. And we eventually whittled it down based on the data and what it was telling us. But I wanted them to have control over their WIP limits and over their process. And that meant experimenting a little and knowing that maybe it wasn't going to be the output they desired.
So that's interesting on a number of different levels. I mean, I think, okay, let's try it your way is actually a really great strategy, right? On a number of levels. It lets them learn from the data. It says, I'm not the ultimate authority. Your ideas are worthy of trying, just as mine are. I am willing to be influenced by you, which I think is another super important thing in change. If you want to change other people, you have to be willing to be changed by them. So that's a great strategy. And you make it time bound and say, let's see what we can learn from this.
Well, it's another way of helping them own things, right? Even if it's the wrong decision, then you help them. It's not me telling you want to do this. Like, okay, great. Like have at it. You mentioned you mentioned the book Attending to Networks, right? Like those making sure those relationships stay healthy is what lets me stay around long enough with the client, hopefully to get some sort of positive change. Because if you don't care about relationships, you'll be gone and sooner than later, right? So if they are going to standardize something, then I always say, well, let's get a little, like just a couple things standardized, like standardize as little as possible, make it as loosely standardized as possible. That way there's, gray area, room for work, and I'm keeping the relationship solid.
Standardize where it makes sense to standardize.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, we all, the sockets on light bulbs are the same in this country, right? I mean, it makes a ton of sense to standardize on that. But you have to be aware of when variation is a natural part of the structure of the work or the nature of the work, right? And then I think it's often useful to have some sort of boundaries or some sort of guidelines about, here's reasonable variation. This is the outcome we want. These are the things we would never do. This is what we're trying to achieve. And within this, you have a lot of discretion about what you can do.
Yeah, kind of guardrails or here's the box. We'll shape the box. You can play inside this.
Yeah. And the boundaries don't mean, you can never go outside this. It means that we have some sort of explicit boundary. And if you bump up against it, we have a conversation. Sometimes it makes sense to make the boundary a little more flexible.
Definitely. There's another section in the book I wanted to ask you about. You talk about acknowledging negative space, and there's a specific question there that stood out to me about slack in the system. Why is slack important when we think about change?
People need time to learn. They need time to adjust to a new situation. They need time to gain skills. They need time to gain capabilities. They need time to think. They need time to reflect. So if there's no slack in your system, the likelihood that you will get any sort of change based on consideration and discretion and judgment is slight. You know, things will still change, but it'll be kind of random.
Well, it's so crazy to me. I see, you know, and Chris, I'd be curious what you see here, but I feel like a lot of times when we think about agile transformation or bringing in agile practices, it's often done when there's a lot of other critical things happening at the same time. You know, there's a deadline or a system replacement or all this other urgent stuff that's taking place. And it's like, well, in order to hit that, we're also going to change the way we do everything. And there's zero slack in the system. Yeah. Do you run into that too?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that, see, whenever Esther first started talking about like Slack, I first made it, I thought, well, that makes it seem less like a huge giant Band-Aid being ripped off. But 9 times out of 10, that's why I show up at a client, is because there is a Band-Aid that needs to be ripped off. Like this giant thing needs to be delivered. And they think, oh, well, if I just pull this framework in, or if I just pay a consultant to come in and do this, we've been wanting to do some things anyways. The problem is that we don't get, all the people that we're working with don't ever get that context. I just show up and they go, yo, work with this Texan. And they have to, and then they have to wrestle with that fact while I'm trying to get them to do stuff. And at the same time, they're like, well, why? We're, you know, whatever, we've got this huge deadline. We don't need to be doing change. Well, you know, anyways, it's all, it makes it more difficult for me to do my job when that happens.
Sure. And there's no perfect time to introduce a change. There are some that are worse, you know, like when, there's a lot of deadline pressure and people are involved in a bunch of other stuff going on. But in that sort of situation, I mean, I might say, you know, what would make your job easier? What would make it more likely that you can get the most important stuff done in this tight deadline? You know, what's getting in your way? And chances are, when they bring those things up, then and you think about what might help that situation, chances are pretty good that something related to agile methods will be helpful.
Yeah.
One of the other things I run into, I feel like a lot in our space, is just change fatigue, right?
Oh yeah.
You know, like, okay, this is the flavor of the month and it's not going to stick. And I think, you know, what's your approach for addressing that fatigue in an organization?
Well, just acknowledge it. And often don't, make it such a big deal. You know, we're not here for a transformation. We're here to see how we can improve the way things are working, right? So, I mean, I think it's actually quite a reasonable response for people to be cynical and to say, well, this is flavor of the month, because that's been their lived experience, right? So, I mean, I've maybe been through a few more cycles of that than you guys, but it's often true. So
so most of the change, I think an unfortunate part about our industry today is you said Colleen brought up the T word, transformation. We're in the midst of recording a series on transformation in organizations, and this kind of just happened to fit right into it in a serendipitous way. But we most of the change that we see is related to like, well, we're going to bring this framework in, right? And I say this all the time, that if your idea of change is do the whatever the framework name is, do the Scrum or do the SAFe or do the like whatever, like that doesn't really acknowledge the change, right? That doesn't help us understand. That doesn't understand like what it is, like what, like going back to the topic of like, what's our vision, right? Where are we? What do we actually want to change? Changing is not just doing a framework. Changing is not just get stuff done cheaper, faster, better.
Right.
Right. Like that's implicit in it, but it's not in and of itself change.
Well, I think it goes back to the idea that you have to understand what is holding the current pattern in place. And slapping a framework on top of that is not necessarily going to help the situation if you don't address what holds the pattern in place, right? And that, I think that doesn't often get enough examination, right? So we're going to implement some new framework, like we're retooling our factory, but we are not looking at, why is it that we are experiencing a pattern of results of our projects always being late and over budget? Why is it we are experiencing a pattern of our customers are dissatisfied with our software? Why is it we are experiencing a pattern of, crashes, every time we deploy new software? Why is it? And look at the system, not just the people. The tendency is to look at, well, our people aren't working hard enough, or, so you need to really understand what contributes to the current pattern if you want to change it.
Yeah. And
radical thinking.
Well, I mean, it's there are many listeners who will think that seems pretty basic. And I think that in the end, that's a kind of theme that goes through your book, is like, none of these rules are in and of themselves hard, right? They're, you have a very, what I've always appreciated about your writing and your speaking style is it's very plain, very, to a person, kind of relatable. None of this in and of itself is really that complex, but because it involves people, that's where the complexity, lies.
I think what often happens is that people know stuff in their real life that kind of leaves their head when they come into the office. And I think it relates to, this thinking about organizations as machines in some way. But like, for example, Colleen, you were talking about the team that wanted their WIP limit of 30, right? I doubt anybody would say, I'm going to work on 30 home improvement projects at the same time. Or I'm going to tell my children to work on 30 homework problems at the same time, or I'm going to have 30 knitting projects going at the same time. Nobody would do that, because they, in their real life, they recognize, if I want to finish stuff, I need to finish something before I start the next thing. I'm not going to try to bake 30 cakes at one time. So there's something that happens to people's real life knowledge of working in complexity and getting things accomplished that somehow goes out of their heads when they walk into the office often.
So
and that's
curious,
perplexing.
Yeah. Why is that? Why is it that things that we would never do in our day-to-day life, when we're in our, just going through our, our shopping list or our to-do list at home, why is it that we have that ability to see that? And I'm curious of your perspective too. Why is it that we can do that at home, and yet as soon as we walk in, we have 15 number one priority items, and we think that we can do them all?
Artificial pressure?
Yeah, and I always come back to, you're Esther, you're talking a lot about patterns and constructs of an organization, and almost like social contracts, I think, between one another. And I think some of the same fear that's associated with the change that we're talking about can be connected to what we're talking about with maybe taking on too much change or too much work, or whatever the case may be, because we don't want to let each other down. It's never bad intent that somebody's like, I can work on 30 things at once. We're not trying to do something wrong. We're trying to say yes to our teammates, right? If you point back to some of the stuff that's in Dominica DeGrandis's book, right, of making work visible, it's like we don't want to let each other down. We don't want to be seen as the person not carrying our weight. We're all trying to do the right thing by saying yes to this. Right. And it's those patterns at work, right, of, I'm just going to come by and say, Chris, I need 5 minutes of your time. And you're going to be like, of course, Colleen. Right, Chris?
So
listen, I'll do whatever you want, whenever you want it.
So I think that's absolutely correct. I think there are some additional reasons behind it. Part of it can be fear. If you tell your boss, no, I'm not going to work on that, it generally doesn't work out well for you. I course, this reminded me of a story because I have a million stories. I was working with an organization a number of years ago, and they kept telling me that this was their number one priority project. And I'd look at it and I'd say, well, but people are assigned, part-time, 10% of their time. If this is your most important, their number one priority project, why are people, just part-time on this? Why is this not playing a bigger point? And what eventually came out was that it was actually their number one priority discretionary project behind 13 other projects. And so with some more conversation, I said, well, do you really expect that you'll be able to get these 13 projects done? And the director of the department said, no, I know we won't get them done. But I can tell everybody we're working on their top priority. He had like 13 different stakeholders. I can tell everybody we're working on it, and I'll only get yelled at once a year.
Yep. It's why we never undercommit. Like we never, we may say we do, and some teams may actually see that on the data, but right, when it comes to, regardless of whether it's one thing or 15 number ones, right? We'll always say we can do it. The number of clients
that is a profound failure of leadership.
Yeah,
that is a profound failure of leadership. It is their job to decide. The people in management positions, it's their job to make decisions about what is most important for us to work on first. What is the sequence? Right?
Earlier this year, I had a group of teams planning. And someone from the business side stood up in front of everybody and said, I don't care about you saying, yes, I can do it. What I care more about predictability of what you say you can do rather than the amount of work you can get done. And after she said that, she said, take some things off the board. I know you're overcommitting. Not only did they not take things off the board, they added more things to the board by saying that they could do it after she said, I know you're overcommitting.
So there's something else going on in the system that is pushing that behavior, right? And it might be their bosses, it might be their reward structure, it might just be habit, who knows? But kudos to that leader for standing up and saying that, right? And going back to Colleen, what you were saying, that we don't want to let people down, is a sure way to let people down is to say yes to every request.
Yeah,
that guarantees that you're going to let people down, right?
But I think like your example, right, of if I say I'm working on everything, even if I deliver nothing, there's an illusion there of I've said yes to 10 top priorities. They're all in progress, but none of them will get finished. And it creates this sense of like, well, we're working on it.
And I'll only get yelled at once a year.
Yeah. Which is unfortunate.
So is that trust, is that trust kind of implicit in striving for congruence, that like, if we don't at least start building some bridges at some point in time, we're never gonna kind of be aligned?
Well, I think congruence is sort of the foundation of integrity and trust. And when you say yes to all of the requests that come your way, either because you don't want to let your coworkers down, or because you don't want to, piss off your boss, you don't want to lose your bonus, what you're leaving out is your own self and your own capabilities and your own needs. And ultimately, you're not serving yourself, you're not serving your teammates, you're not serving your organization, right? And saying yes to everything might be happy talk in the short term, but in the long term, it erodes trust.
Yeah, and then there's patterns that I feel like shake out of that too, right?
Sure.
Of that kind of environment. I mean, I think that's where you start to see, I'm sure we've all run into a team where it's like they've estimated that this will be done in 3 weeks, but we know everything takes double what they say. So we pad everything by 50, 100% or 50% or whatever that magic number seems to be, because that trust is gone. Right. And that creates new patterns that are addressing that lack of trust.
And then there's the people who estimate and their boss cuts it in half because, I think that work will expand to fill the time available. You know,
Right.
it results in a lot of game playing.
Oh, man, that's there's definitely a metrics aspect to change and transformation that just becomes gamifying everything, right? To make it seem, to give the appearance of, right? And that's the opposite of integrity, right?
Mm-hmm.
It almost seems like when you didn't say this explicitly, but it just seems like if you want to have integrity, it seems like the word no is truly the foundation of integrity. If
it's certainly helpful.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that the people who don't say no or take on 30 projects at the same time are lacking in integrity. They're responding to the system, right? So I'm not.
That's a good point.
Integrity issue is not on the individual level, right? In these systems, because it's easy to see the person and saying, well, you have no integrity. You said you would, deliver this and you didn't deliver it, so you have no integrity. That's not what I want to say at all. That's just another form of blame. It's, we have to look at the whole system. People are easy to see and easy to blame. The system is harder to see. And we have to look at what are the forces that are influencing this behavior. Why is it that intelligent adults who in their real lives know they can't do 30 things at the same time? We can't get, be working on 30 projects and get something done. What is causing this behavior? And we have to look at the system, not blame the people.
Although I think your knitting example might get me in trouble with my husband. So if we could edit that one out. The number of craft projects I have going on at any given time.
I know. When I used to knit, I had a lot of projects on the needles because you didn't always want to work on the same thing, but
I've just mastered the art of talking about doing things and never actually starting any of them.
Well, that's actually a practice in many organizations.
Yep.
Smart talk is a substitute for actually getting things done. So you're there, and there you are.
Yeah. Okay. So one last topic and question, and then we'll wrap. So you end the 7 rules with like bringing your whole self, right?
Yeah.
And realizing that you are an important part of change, kind of a thing. So I'm to get a little personal with you, right? So you've been not only writing about this, speaking about this topic, but as those of us that write about topics understand, as soon as you write about something, it becomes impossible, even harder to live these things, right? So what have you learned about yourself being a tool of change, like since you've been on this journey of the 7 rules?
I think and part of why I articulated that last rule is that it has become increasingly clear to me, and there's actually a lot of research behind this in social sciences, that it's our ability to show up, be present, connect, and be empathetic that is the differentiator in how successful we are in many, many situations. Right. You could take people with the same academic background, the same professional skills, and in a situation of change, what is going to differentiate them is their ability to be present, show up, connect, be empathetic. And so that has I've been just living that more and more deeply.
Empathy is almost like a muscle that if you don't exercise it, it kind of atrophies a lot. Like as you've kind of exercised your empathy muscle, I had a boss that used to say, putting on my empathy hat when I talk to people. Like as you've put that hat on, like how has your empathy kind of evolved over time? Is it kind of, it stayed present? Is it like, where have you grown in that area?
I try to stand in non-judgment. I don't always succeed. I try to understand where other people are coming from, how they view the world, how they prioritize their values. I don't always succeed, but that's what I try to do.
Yeah. That's amazing. Colleen, what about you? What's hardest about empathy for you, Colleen, when you're with a client?
I mean, I think that the list Esther gave is amazing, and it is really hard to stand in non-judgment when you are often being asked to be the expert, right? And it's they're bringing you in because they want you to guide this change for the organization, and I think it can be very difficult to do that in a way that is giving them a sense of confidence in your abilities, right? You're an expert. Tell us what to do, but is also respecting the history of the organization and the patterns and the structures that are already in place, and doing that in a way where you're not giving them a sense of like, man, I hope Colleen knows what she's doing here. She seems like she's waffling a lot, but also is respecting the current situation in a way where you can say, like, let's like Esther said, let's do these in small bites, and maybe it's one program or one team, or let's prove value with some of these practices in one piece of the overall organization, and then expand it.
Well, so I think that's really profound modeling to say, I have some ideas. I don't have all the answers. I have some ideas and some experiences that are probably going to be helpful, but let's figure out how to do this particular situation together.
Yeah.
Let's figure it out together.
And saying, let's do it together, to me is the most powerful part of what you just said, right?
Yeah.
We're going to do this. We're going to introduce change to your business together, and we're going to collaborate on the best way to do that. And it might be different for one group than it is for another.
And we don't know all the answers right now. Some of these answers we're just going to have to figure out as we go.
Yeah, I like that idea of we're almost being paid to judge. Like, you're here to judge where we're at, and yet we say I'm not here to judge. Like, what do I know, kind of a thing. I always struggle with my account teams when they say, look, they're paying us a lot of money for our opinions. Right. It would do you well to give them. And I always struggle by saying, well, but if I give them opinions, they're either easily explained away, they're easily reasoned with, or whatever, or well, you just don't understand, kind of a thing. So I'd rather than giving opinions, if I hopefully ask enough questions for them to realize that they themselves can say their struggle with, and that's not me judging, that's just me helping them.
Well, so there's a difference between making judgments, making discernments, and being judgmental, right?
Yeah.
I have to make judgments about situations. I have to make judgments about what is a reasonable way to try to move forward here. If only 2 steps forward or 3 steps forward, what is a reasonable judgment about the risks involved? What I'm really talking about is not being judgmental about the people.
Yeah. I try to let people know that just because, like, you can be respectful and understand where people are at and still disagree with what they're doing, right?
Sure.
It's okay if we disagree on how to get something done, and maybe we're both right and maybe we're both wrong. So
could be.
I think my biggest struggle is that I think that whether I'm doing a training class or a seminar or a workshop or whatever, I always think, gosh, these things are so boring. So I'm gonna work so hard to make sure it's fun. And so sometimes I play this character and I try to be, jovial and, chuckle in the room, kind of a thing. And like, as well, if we're gonna do this, we might as well have fun doing it. And sometimes that leads to me not taking. Me giving the impression that I don't take really anything very seriously, and maybe I don't, right? But there is a time where I have to go, look, jokes aside, this kind of sucks that this is going on in your organization. We should probably do something about it. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of ways to do it. So what would be your first attempt at trying to fix it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's it's always so hard, and it's hard for us to, regardless of how long we've been doing it, that's still hard for us to say to them of, this sucks, not you suck, but this sucks. So let's fix it. Right.
Well, I don't even think you have to say it sucks. You just have to say, this isn't serving you.
Yeah.
This is not getting you the results you want. This is not providing what you want for your customers or your employees or anyone else. So I personally would phrase it quite differently.
You got to Marie Kondo your practices as an organization.
Yeah. And and there are times where if there's something that's abusive, then you have to call it out. But most of the time, it's just like, this isn't serving you. This is not getting you where you need to be.
Yeah. Man. This is probably one of those things that we could spend several glasses of wine continuing to talk over. But
it's a little early for that.
I mean,
at least in my world.
Is it? So it's almost noon here in Texas.
It's a little early in my world.
So Esther, I thank you so much for. I know you said you felt stuck, but I just wanted to tell you thank you for getting unstuck and shipping this, because I think that, as Colleen said, I think this is a really important book and an important topic. If you don't know where to find the 7 Rules book, there's this thing called Google. You can
Amazon.
Use it.
Wherever fine books are sold.
We'll include an Amazon link in our show notes, but I just want to thank you, Esther, for always you talk about being present. I love that you're present in the community and that you show up. You still try to do as many conferences as you can and just be a person of the community. And you're going to hate to hear this, but I'm thankful to call you a mentor and a friend. And I know Colleen would say the same thing.
Absolutely. I would say, I want to echo that thanks, especially going into the week of Thanksgiving here, and say that I think this book was really eye-opening for me. I think it can, as a coach, we can go into a lot of organizations and feel like this isn't set up for change, or I haven't been brought in at the right time, or your expectations are unrealistic. And this book really made me kind of hold a mirror up to how I'm approaching what I do in a way that made me feel like, think about those patterns, think about what you're walking into, think about the past, think about the backgrounds they have. And that when we feel like we may be met with resistance, that it's not us personally either, right? That there's a lot of, I don't want to use the word baggage, but there's a lot of history that we're not always privy to. And it just struck me at a really important time, I feel like, in my career. I can't recommend this book enough.
Well, I am humbled by your words, and I'm grateful that it has been useful to you.
So thank you so much.
And thank you for this lively conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for listening. As usual, if you love this podcast, please share it. You all should be sharing this, because this is something that, for you change agents out there, share it in your orgs. You folks that are struggling with change, or want to have a conversation with Esther about it, we'll include her website, and I'm sure you can get in touch with her about it. Thanks everybody for listening. And as we get into the holiday season, make sure that you get plenty of rest and recharge and some slack in your schedule, and we'll talk with you soon. Thanks, gang.
Thank you.
Got stabbed in the children with like a syringe full of AIDS.